Good evening, everybody. My name is Douglas Peers, Director of the Global Engagement Seminar, a past dean, and a variety of other things, some of which are probably not worth mentioning. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Global Engagement Seminar. But before I do that, I would like to do as customary, which is to honor and to make the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. By making this statement, I'm well aware of its significance. I'm a historian, and I'm not only acknowledging generations of historical wrongs and injustices, but also, on a more positive note, our commitment to working respectfully and collaboratively for a better future for all, and with greater attention to the environment for which we are responsible, and for which Al MacDonald's ceremony provided such ample evidence. The purpose of the Global Engagement Seminar, it's a program designed for students, and parenthetically also instructors, who are curious, creative, want to work collaboratively, and have the courage to participate in a very non-typical course. For it is not about content, it is about questions. And the thornier the question, the better. And we would be hard-pressed to think of a more pressing question than that of equitable and sustainable access to energy. In mounting this program, we are indebted to many friends and supporters, and this program is inconceivable without their ongoing commitment. I'd like first of all, to thank Al MacDonald for leading the fire ceremony and for reminding us of our obligations to Mother Earth. And to Stephanie and our hosts at United College for graciously welcoming us again. And our 2 instructors who took the risk this year to work on such a, what might appear to be an unstructured way forward, Professors Magdi Salama and Professor Angela Carter. And we were also blessed with 6 Jaroslawski Fellows who enthusiastically shared their experiences and insights, and in so doing inspired the projects you will see this evening. Tarek Abdul-Galil, Mohab Elshnar, Courtney Howard, Melina Labukan Massimo, Afshin Matan, and Shruti Sharma. Our donors, the Jaroslawski Foundation and the Desmarais Family Foundation, whose commitment to teaching and innovation, to making a better world, and to breaking down silos has enabled us to offer this program. Closer to home, Rebecca Zare, our Sherpa and Time Lord, who's worked so hard on this project. Mitch from Sherwood, who's been with us all along. We have 2 veterans of our advisory board from previous years who've blessed us tonight, Ed Struzak and Heather Chui. But most of all, I'd like to thank our students who took a chance with us and with each other to try and brainstorm their way through such a thorny problem. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Angela Carter to come up and to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Doug. All right, before I say another thing, there's a couple of chairs right here, there's some right here, and another here and some here. So if you want to come, if you have a need to sit, please come and find yourself some chairs. I'm going to give you a moment. Anyone who wants to come up, make your way. And then I'll tell you a little bit about Catherine Abreu. All right, don't be shy. If you'd like a seat, if you need a seat, there's 2 right here. There's a couple here that could be brought over as well. Come help yourselves. All right, so it is a delight and a pleasure to introduce you to Catherine Abreu. Catherine is an internationally and nationally recognized and renowned award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions so that we can advance action on climate change. Catherine has been named one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy. And as such, you might have seen her work already in influential international and national media outlets where her work is cited and where she's featured as a spokesperson. She's got over 15 years experience campaigning on environmental issues, primarily climate issues. She's a dedicated collaborator and community organizer. In the last decade, in fact, she has founded and supported over a dozen distinct coalitions, nationally, internationally, on environmental issues and arts advocacy as well. Notably, she served as the executive director of CANRAC, so that's our Climate Action Network, which is our biggest, and I would argue most influential climate policy network. It brings together over 120 organizations to push for better action on climate policy from coast to coast in this country. And she was the executive director and is now on the board of directors because she's got all kinds of other tasks, leading Destination Zero, an organization which she's recently founded, and also she is now one of the 14 appointed advisors to Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body, as well as on the Advisory Council to the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. So anything that you need to know about climate policy in Canada and internationally, Kat is your go-to. I want to say more personally, though, that Kat is just a force for change and a real beacon of hope in this landscape, which is sometimes quite anxiety-inducing. But I go to Kat for inspiration for how we can make the changes that we need. And not only is she a beacon of hope, but she's also a mentor for people that seek to amplify her work and join in it. So I'm so glad that you could join us. And yeah, come tell us a little bit about your life and work and where we need to go next. Kat.
I'm going to put this down because I have my own microphone. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Angela. And yeah, thanks to all of you for having me this evening. It's really great to be here. My name's Catherine, or Kat Abreu. I'm the founder and executive director of Destination Zero, as you just heard, where we really focus on work that accelerates the global energy transition away from fossil fuel dependence toward efficient renewable energy. And we do that by really focusing on coalition and relationship building, because it's my assessment from over a decade of doing this work that really the biggest changes result from good relationships and strong relationships built on trust. I want to just appreciate the amazing work that's gone into the presentations on display today. I've already heard about 2 of them that were really fascinating and exciting, and I'm so impressed by your knowledge and your passion that you're bringing to this issue, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the 3rd presentation. So please do go out there and hear from the students after my talk. And yeah, a big thank you to Al for helping us open the evening in a good way. Yeah, man, a smudge is an incredible thing to have. It's a real gift, so thank you. All right. Oh, yeah, maybe I should say, so I was asked to give a title for a talk. I really hate giving titles to things. And in part it's because sometimes I can be a little dramatic. I am a theater kid at heart, and I came up with a kind of dramatic name for my talk. Where is the renewables revolution we were promised? And I initially called it a deep dive into the real politic of the global energy transition, but I'm only speaking for 30 minutes, so we can't go deep, actually. I'll give you a little bit of insight into where this kind of dramatic feeling came from for me. So about a decade ago, I was very early in my career as a climate activist working to advance clean energy solutions in Atlantic Canada. I was working at the Ecology Action Centre in Mi'kma'ki, what's also known as Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. And I was helping to establish Nova Scotia's community feed-in tariff program, which resulted in a huge number of very successful renewable energy projects in the province that were in part owned and operated by the community that they were built in. And I was also helping to set up Efficiency Nova Scotia, which is one of one of North America's, not just Atlantic Canada's, first energy efficiency utilities. So it actually sells energy efficiency into the energy market in Nova Scotia. And I was feeling this incredible excitement about this renewable energy efficiency revolution that was just on the horizon, was doing that work of implementation on the ground in Nova Scotia, where we were seeing a real political commitment across the spectrum in that province. So some of the earliest renewable energy and energy efficiency policies in that province were put in place by progressive conservative governments. And it felt like there was just so much potential and it was all happening. So much so that a local small wind turbine manufacturer went out of business because their wind turbines were too small and we needed them to be bigger. And that was, one of my earliest kind of media opportunities, was commenting on that. Sorry, turn this around, there we go. And of course, this idea of a community feed-in tariff, of a feed-in tariff in general, of many of these renewable energy policies were coming out of Germany, where they were in the midst of their Energiewende, where they were transforming their energy systems in that country in a matter of about 15 years. And you can see here the projections for the increase in renewable energies in the German energy systems that they were projecting, and the real reductions in emissions that that was resulting in. And it wasn't just reducing emissions and changing the energy systems in Germany, it was transforming their economy and their job landscape. It was transforming their export economy. It was creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in the country. And it was creating this powerful social consensus around the transition to renewable energy. And it felt like we were seeing that start to be replicated all around the world, including in many provinces in Canada. And then in 2015, so a few years after that, we got a new federal government in Canada, one that seemed interested in the issue of climate change finally. And the way that that new government under Justin Trudeau was welcomed into office was by a huge protest, one of the largest climate protests in Canadian history up till that point, that was all about transitioning to 100% renewable energy. It was called the 100% Possible March. It brought 25,000 people to Ottawa, which we felt was huge at the time because we didn't know that 4 years later in 2019 there would be 500,000 people in the streets of Montreal. And we even tried to deliver solar panels to 24 Sussex, which were rejected. So, it was kind of all about like this renewable energy revolution just on the horizon, just on the cusp. But we kind of got a rough reality check at some point later in the last decade. We realized, many of us didn't realize this. We'd been paying attention the whole time and we knew this to be true. But there began to be more of a reckoning, I would say, both in domestic conversations and at the international level that, hey, all these great targets that we're making, all of these promises that we're signing up to on the international stage, it's not actually delivering emissions reductions. And hey, all of this work that we're doing on renewable energy and energy efficiency isn't really delivering that energy transformation that we thought it would, or at least not in as timely a way as we thought it would. And so, we get to this point where in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases its landmark report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That really sets a benchmark for the absolute upper limit of where emissions can go for us to avoid the most irreversible impacts of climate change. And it also says we've kind of consumed a huge chunk of the global carbon budget for that 1.5 degree threshold already. And we have to ramp down our emissions hard in the next decade if we're going to get on that 1.5 degree pathway. We also get the reality check in terms of the real impacts on the ground, right? In Canada, globally, we're seeing at this point average warming of about 1.1 degrees Celsius around the world. But that's a global average. That means there are some places in the world warming much faster than that, and Canada is one of those places. Canada is warming on average at 2 times the global rate, and in the north of so-called Canada, that's around 3 times the global rate of warming. And so we're starting to feel those devastating impacts of the climate crisis on the ground, including in places like Canada, where we've thought about climate change as being a far-off problem for far too long. And here's the truth of it, that in 2023, after going on 35 years of international climate negotiations and 1.1 degrees of global warming and all of the crazy storms, weird weather, fires that come with that, 80% of the global energy mix and 6% of carbon dioxide emissions in the past decade alone are from 3 products: oil, gas, and coal. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, just released another report last week. This is the 6th assessment report that the IPCC has done on the state of climate change globally. And with this report, we have definitive word from global scientists. We have consensus that fossil fuels are the #1 thing standing in the way of us meeting our climate commitments and holding warming to manageable thresholds. And when I say manageable, that's a very generous way of putting it, because many of those impacts are already unmanageable for many people. So this statement, this headline statement coming from this report of global scientists, is quite unprecedented, actually. And part of why that's unprecedented is because the process to get to this headline statement was a very political process that involved negotiations from all the member countries to the UN and IPCC. And that means this is lowest common denominator language. This means that all the big fossil fuel producers in the room worked as hard as they could to get that sentence to be as weak as it could possibly be. And so still, with that sentence being as weak as it can possibly be, it is very clear that fossil fuel infrastructure is the #1 thing that's going to push us over the edge of being able to deliver on the global climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. What else does that IPCC report says? It says that the largest share and growth in gross greenhouse gas emissions occurring in CO2 in recent decades is from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes. And it says that emissions during the 2010 to 2019 period, so over the course of the last decade, are the highest they've ever been. So once again, here we are, 35 years into a process to address this crisis, and emissions in the last decade, where we've been having a COP every single year, are higher than they've ever been. And fossil fuels is the reason for that. This I'm not going to go through in as much detail, but basically what this piece is saying is that not only is a transition away from fossil fuel-based energy systems absolutely critical for us delivering on our climate targets, but when the IPCC scientists assess the various factors related to that energy transition, they find that improvements in switching to renewables and energy efficiency also really improves the resilience of energy systems, the affordability of energy costs, and the health conditions of communities. Sorry, we lost these pictures. And the health conditions of communities in which that energy is being produced. Unfortunately, these pictures aren't showing up, but basically what they show is that despite all of this evidence, we still have major nations, including nations that talk a big talk on the international stage about climate leadership, signing contracts for new fossil fuel projects. And that was a significant theme in 2022. We saw Germany, I talked about their huge energy transition, but Germany has in the last year resorted to an increase in coal-fired electricity to make up for the loss in gas imports from Russia. We've also seen increasing reliance on fossil fuels in China. We've seen Canada approving the Bay du Nord offshore project in Newfoundland. We've seen the US recently approving the Willow project in Alaska. So despite all of this evidence, despite this conclusive findings of the global scientists, governments are still out of step with this reality. So what's going on here? Why is it that decades ago, we were seeing evidence around the world of the potential for renewable energy and its ability to transform electricity and energy systems globally and remove our dependence on fossil fuels? Where is that renewable revolution? Well, the 2022 energy crisis, which is more accurately a fossil fuel crisis that was spurred by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, actually provides us some tremendous insights into the answer to that question of where the renewable revolution is. And we can't go through all of the ways in which we've learned some important lessons in the last year about it, but I'm going to focus on these 3 areas. We've learned a lot about the destructive influence of fossil fuel dependence and the rapacious appetite of the fossil fuel industry. We've learned about the really insidious lag in policies and investments to support the growth in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we've learned our fair share about the increasingly complex geopolitics of energy and energy transitions. At the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was some really fascinating writing coming from academics and scientists in Ukraine about the ways in which this war is powered by fossil fuels. Powered by it practically speaking, but also ideologically speaking. I've posted here an image from an article written by Bill McKibben, who is, of course, a famous scientist, NASA scientist, who was one of the early alarm bell ringers on the climate crisis, about this connection between fossil fuels, autocracies, and militarism. And that is, I think, a really potent part of the conversation around energy systems and security that has been missing for quite a long time. We also saw, through 2022, the fossil fuel industry raking in unprecedented profits. In that year alone, the 5 biggest oil companies in the world doubled the profits, doubled the highest profits that they had ever made in 1 year, from something just over 100 trillion in a year to 219 trillion in 2022. It's outrageous. And they poured the vast majority of that money into paying back dividends to shareholders and paying off debt, rather than, doing all this happy investing in renewable energy that we hear the fossil fuel money is going to do. This insane profit making from the fossil fuel industry has really put a spotlight on the ways in which that industry soaks up so much global wealth that it then fails to redistribute to other economies. So, for instance, in emerging economies where we see fossil fuel development, more often than not, we do not see that fossil fuel development money trickling down to the average people who are looking to improve their livelihoods within those economies. More often than not, much of that wealth gets exported along with the fossil fuels, and what stays in the country remains in a few elite hands. And we learned a lot about that economy of fossil fuels in 2022. We also heard from the European Central Bank a new concept, a new economic concept called fossilflation, which was another uncovering of part of the insidious economics of the fossil fuel paradigm. The head of the bank or the member of executive board of the European Central Bank talked about climateflation, so inflation that's caused by rising costs related to devastating climate impacts, and fossilflation, inflation that's related to a delayed transition away from fossil fuel dependence and a resulting sensitivity, vulnerability to the volatility of prices in fossil fuel markets. And just to illustrate that point, take a look at the insane the wild volatility in fossil fuel prices tracked by the International Energy Agency that resulted after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And finally, despite all of these drawbacks in 2022, we also saw that regardless of these impacts, the fossil fuel industry is pushing ever-expanding fossil fuel production. So a report in 2022 found that oil and gas companies are planning huge expansion in the coming years, and that most of the expansion plans that are being laid have actually developed in just the last couple of years alone, when we have been having this global conversation about the need to reduce emissions and finally deliver on our climate commitments. And so since 2021, the fossil fuel industry has increased its expansion plans by about 20%. So it's only ever expecting to get bigger. And it's getting bigger in riskier places. So most recently, we in Canada have been seeing stars like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jane Fonda tweet about this project that a Canadian company is pursuing in one of the most ecologically and culturally sensitive places in the world that's protected by international treaties, and in fact have engaged in illegal activities in order to push exploration in the Okavango Delta. So that's kind of one theme of what we took away from 2022. We also learned a lot about why renewable energy and energy efficiency policy has been lagging and why investments in those things have been lagging. And interestingly enough, we learned that through the acceleration in renewable energy policy and investments that we saw in 2022. So counterintuitively, even though we heard all of this political rhetoric around expanding fossil fuels because Russia, we have to get off Russia gas, and so let's find gas wherever else we can in the world. Despite hearing a lot of that political rhetoric in the news, it turns out that the policies that the European Union, the United States, Japan, and other countries have put in place in the last year have really accelerated the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency in a way that we have been looking for the last decade. And in that acceleration, we see that it really could have happened quite a long time ago. So this chart is from the latest International Energy Agency report, and it shows the exponential increase in renewable power forecasting in the last decade alone. And this year, in 2023, we saw the International Energy Agency put out its most robust, so its most exciting predictions for renewable energy ever. And it is predicting that in the next 5 years, renewable energy will grow as much as it has grown in the last 20. So it's predicting that we will double renewable energy capacity in the world in the next 5 years from what we've built in the last 20. And that's indeed because Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a turning point, in particular for renewable energy in Europe. We're also learning, however, that this new demand for increased renewable energy, while it's being met for now, there will be gaps in the ability to meet that demand because renewable energy supply chains have not yet matured and developed to the place that they need to be to meet that rapidly growing demand. And I think it's really interesting when we see companies like McKinsey, which isn't known for being like the most environmentally progressive company out there, are writing articles about how we can build more robust renewable energy supply chains really quickly because we are seeing such an acceleration of uptake of renewable energy policy as a result of the last year. That being said, despite this acceleration and this progress, we of course are seeing that pushback. And that's giving us some insight into why this hasn't happened sooner. A big part of it is because of the incredible power and influence of the incumbent industry, which is the fossil fuel industry. And in 2022, we saw some great coverage about the incredible power, the lobbying power of that industry, including the amount of lobbyists at last year's UN climate conference outnumbering the amount of country delegates from any country that were present at that climate conference. So the lobbying power of this industry is huge, and it far outstrips the lobbying power of renewables and efficiency. And investments in renewables and efficiency have been lagging behind investments in fossil fuels, of course. And that's why it doesn't work when we hear people talk about their investments in renewable energy, but failing to discuss their investments in fossil fuels. Some of you may have heard that the United Arab Emirates, who are hosting this year's climate conference, placed the head of their oil and gas company, ADNOC, as the president of these climate talks. And the reason they think that that's a legitimate choice is because ADNOC and Sultan Al Jaber, the president, is investing heavily in renewable energy. But the truth is that the amount that they're investing in renewable energy is outstripped by about 30 times the amount that they're investing in fossil fuels. And we learned that lesson pretty hard in 2022, that there's a huge investment gap in renewable energy. These numbers come from the most recent International Renewable Energy Association's report, where they're talking about the fact that, number one, investment in renewable energy is bigger than ever in the last year. It broke $1 trillion for the first time ever, which is huge. But that $1 trillion is the amount of money that the fossil fuel industry is planning to spend in expansion year over year from now until 2030. So IRENA is making this point of we can directly transfer these huge investments that are being made in fossil fuel expansion and turn that into the renewable energy projects that we need to power our global economy. The third theme that I said we learned a lot about in 2022 that I'll spend a little bit of time on is this complex geopolitics of energy and energy transition. And where this particularly came down in the conversations last year was around the issues of equity and development. So there was this big push into when Russia invaded Ukraine and governments around the world were trying to wean themselves off of Russian gas. They were looking around to other markets to develop gas, and the fossil fuel industry was like right there, really excited about it with dollar signs in their eyes. There was a big push to move into Africa and develop potential resources in Africa. And there's this split in the dialogue amongst many African countries where some are seeing an opportunity to perhaps rake in revenue and use that revenue to meet some of their development goals. And it's being turned into a call from some across the African continent for Africa to finally take advantage of the opportunities that colonial countries have had the opportunity to take advantage of. And it's really, it's become an issue that's about more than energy systems. But then there are also many communities across Africa that are saying, let's not repeat the mistakes of developed countries that have grown from fossil fuel dependence. Let's chart another course for Africa that has some of the best renewable energy resources out there. So we're really seeing, I think, in African countries and across that continent, this split in the conversation around this nexus of energy systems, development, the need to provide energy access to populations, and how that interacts with moving away from fossil fuels and moving toward renewable energy. We also learned a lot about the ways in which the global economy is super sunken to fossil fuels, and economies between countries are incredibly interconnected and intertied through their investments in fossil fuels. And actually a big part of how we learned that was by some of those Western countries trying to divest from Russia and failing because they couldn't figure out how to do it because they're so deeply entrenched. So that that lesson about how challenging it will be for some economies to extract themselves from continuing to just pour money into the problem was, I think, a really potent one. And indeed, those amounts of money are huge and getting bigger. Once again, in 2022, the amount of money that was transferred from energy consumers to energy producers was gigantic. And if you look at this graph, you start to see some of the underlying reasons for the price crunches that many of us are feeling in our day-to-day lives in 2023. But this issue around geopolitics and the complexities of it, it's not exclusive to our existing fossil fueled energy system. It also pertains to potential energy systems that we move forward to. So issues around political interconnectedness, diplomatic priorities, and domestic exceptionalism for different countries are also arising around the critical minerals that are needed to produce renewable energy and clean technologies. And so there's an emerging, really hot conversation on the global stage about how we work to avoid replicating some of the missteps in that fossil fuel economy as we move toward renewable energy. And there's actually a project about that in the room. Okay. Getting toward the end of my presentation, I always like to move toward the good news. So wanted to give us a little bit of a deep dive, or a little bit of a dive, not deep, into that real politic of the global energy transition. But the good news is that renewable energy and energy efficiency are winners, right? In many very practical, observable ways. Solar energy costs have declined 90% globally since 2009. In that same time period, wind energy costs have declined by 70%. 83% of all power capacity that was added in 2022, so note that's power capacity, that means our electricity systems, came from renewable energy, which is a huge number and continues to grow year over year. And by the end of 2022, we saw a record-breaking growth in the amount of renewable power added to the global grids, a 9.6% growth in 2022. And that growth is reflected by the climb in investment dollars that we've seen into renewables in that time. So still, we're not getting to that number that we need to be at for the renewable revolution to truly be a reality, but investments are growing significantly. The other pieces that are, of course, important on this front are how our transportation systems are transforming, because that is the predominant demand for fossil fuels outside of electricity systems, and we've seen how electricity systems are changing. But transportation systems are changing as well. And we can see that increasing amounts of jurisdictions are putting in place bans on internal combustion engines. And that will have a pretty radical impact on the global landscape for personal vehicle transportation in the coming decade, because many of those bans on internal combustion engines are along the 2035 timeline. And efficiency is also getting a real leg up. The global economy used energy about 2% more efficiently in 2022 than it did in 2021. And if we can keep that up, if we can keep that 2% incremental increase in energy efficiency year over year, it actually goes a really long way to putting us on track to meeting our climate commitments. What does this look like in Canada? Well, in Canada, we saw solar capacity growing by almost 26% in 2022. We're ranked 22nd in the world for solar capacity globally. We're ranked 8th in the world for installed wind energy, and that grew about 7% last year. And this is, I think, a really beautiful and important part of the story in Canada, and that's that 20% of the renewable energy projects in Canada are owned and operated in Indigenous communities. So in sum, when we ask the question, where's the renewable energy revolution we were promised? we see, well, actually renewables and efficiency are here in a really big way. Not only are they effective in meeting our climate commitments, but they are effective in driving down costs for people, making our homes and communities more comfortable, and making them a lot healthier. That energy revolution is possible if we can maintain the progress that we saw in 2022 year over year and expand it to different geographies. So as I said, that progress has been concentrated in mostly Western economies in the last year. We need to be seeing that expand across all economies. We know what stands in our way. Fossil fuel hegemony, which is a bit jargony, but I kind of use that concept to say, this global system that kind of props up our dependence on fossil fuels and the ongoing expansion of the industry. So that is a big part of what is standing in our way of making this revolution possible. The tangled economics of it all is a big one to unpack as well. And of course, we need to be maturing the renewable energy and energy efficiency industries as the demand for the services they provide grows, because those policies and investments are being made by global governments and investors into renewables and efficiency. And finally, and I think this is the big takeaway, big change can happen in a really short time. None of us were expecting that huge turnaround in 2022. And I think actually it's not even that visible to a lot of people yet, because we're still wrapped up in the conversations around the fossil fuel crisis spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the reality is that we are in the midst of a huge energy transition, and we have seen the pace that global governments can respond when they feel they're in an emergency. So far, climate change has not been enough of an impetus to spur that kind of acceleration in global governments. But I think that that's really changing, unfortunately, because of the devastating climate impacts that we are experiencing. But I do hope that the evidence that we've seen in 2022 that this renewable energy revolution is possible encourages global governments to continue making these policy choices and these investments in the future. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
For questions. So invite a few questions, and then I encourage you to go and meet with our students who I think are on their way to identifying the kind of problems we actually need to be talking about now. So any questions from the floor, from the audience, please?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
You mentioned a bit earlier that jurisdictions are clamping down on the internal combustion vehicles, assuming that we have enough capacity to fill that with electric or hydrogen or whatever. Do you see that might drive the market for oil producers downward, rather than us trying to bully the oil companies into not producing these?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like a two-part question. Are the policies that are turning down the taps on internal combustion engines going to have a significant impact on the oil sector and demand for oil? The answer to that question is yes, huge. Like, for instance, the vast majority of oil in Canada is exported to US markets to make gas for US vehicles. And so if we see a radical transformation of the US vehicle fleet, I mean, that has huge implications for Canada's oil and gas sector. But an important addendum to that is that we don't just want to transfer like every internal combustion engine car into an electric vehicle. We want to be investing in public transit solutions, like this 15-minute cities presentation is encouraging us to. And then the other piece of your question is, can we just let demand changes do the work for us and not think about supply? So can we just reduce the demand for gas through internal combustion engine bans and like not worry about the fact that the fossil fuel industry is out there developing the Okavango Delta? And the answer to that is no. We've seen over the course of the last 35 years what focusing on demand without focusing on supply gets us, and it gets us the highest amount of emissions in the last decade that we've ever seen. So I believe pretty strongly that we have to cut with both sides of the scissors. As a very famous policy paper on this issue suggests. Yeah. I saw Julie. Julia, thank you.
I guess it's really trying to hear that one of the points is like the geopolitics of like minerals and things like that. Given our project on like what rare metals are required in solar panels and how they're being wasted in landfills. So do you know any more about like I guess could you just speak more about what the situation is like and what's being done to reclaim those minerals?
Yeah. Like, honestly, the short answer is not enough. It's a very active conversation, but right now I would say that the global conversation around critical minerals is mostly around problem identification rather than like finding collective solutions. And a part of that is because the international spaces that we come together in are not actually designed to get us to have those conversations. And that's a little bit of what those of us who've been working to bring the supply side of the equation into the conversation have been saying in the international level is like, when we go to UN climate conferences, they should be a space where every country in the world talks about circular economy policies for critical minerals and renewable energy. Like, we're trying to transform global energy systems. Why don't we use the annual COPs to transform global energy systems? And so that's why we have initiatives like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which some of you might have heard in the room. I'm on the steering committee for that, that is saying, hey, like maybe the UN climate conferences can't be that space and we need to have an additional space. We need to create another space where we talk about energy specifically.
We have time for one more question. Oh, here, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Kenji, and I was just wondering, there's a lot of diverse backgrounds in this room. With your experience as a climate activist, what can we do in our daily lives to hold our governments accountable to make that shift? Because sometimes it seems so impossible and so disconnected from me as an individual when I see what our federal or international institutions are doing. And from your experience as a climate activist, what can everyone in this room do to really hone in and force our governments
Yeah.
to change?
Thank you so much for this question, and I also really want to commend you for asking the question in a way that it puts it back on governments rather than making it all about individual responsibility, because that's exactly right. Often I get asked that question in like a way that's more about what we as individuals can do. And that's not to say that we as individuals don't have power. We do have tremendous power. But the reality is that like the efforts I do to eat less meat and not drive a car and turn off my lights are not going to change the world. And what is going to change the world is all of us doing that as a community in an intentional way with a political message. And that is the recommendation that I make, basically. So my 3-step plan for what we can do to make a difference in order of importance is talk to your family and friends about climate change, build community around this issue, and build that community in a political way. And political way doesn't necessarily have to mean talking to politicians. Political can mean being present in your community, building a community garden and involving your community members in it. You know, that kind of conversation that starts to make it about the collective rather than the individual is powerful. And it's powerful because it opens the door for other people to care about this issue. And why we have to do that is because all of us have to be talking to our elected officials, step number 2, about climate change, regardless of our political identity. That's particularly important in Canada, where climate change remains a polarized issue. Unfortunately, you know, like I can say with confidence that conservatives are experiencing the impacts of climate change and that many conservatives in Canada care about climate change, but their politicians don't represent their caring about climate change, and that needs to change in this country. So every politician needs to hear from you that we expect them to have a meaningful plan on how to address the climate crisis. And finally, see if you can use energy less and better. And that might mean a variety of things for you in your personal life, but it is true that living closer to our values helps us be able to have those conversations with the people we care about. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to, again, just ask everybody to join me again, thanking Kat for a great talk.